Hi, I'm Cindy from CPSE, and I'd like to welcome you to Esri's sponsored webinar, Identifying Risk in the Community, GIS Provides Answers. Presenting today are Mike Cox, the Director of Fire and EMS Solutions for Esri, and Joe Powers, Deputy Chief of Community Risk Reduction with Charlottesville Fire Department. Mike is responsible for advocating how fire and EMS agencies leverage geospatial information and technology to achieve their response and recovery goals. He retired from Henrico, Virginia Fire Department as Deputy Chief after 27 years. Joe is a 26-year veteran of the fire service and works with the fire departments to improve operational response, reduce organizational workload, and tie data to strategic decision-making. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording so you can share it with others. At the end of the webinar, please contact Mike directly for additional information and be sure to visit their booth at the 2121 Excellence Conference, March 2nd through 5th at the Caribe Royale Convention Center in Orlando, Florida. Thank you for attending, and now Mike will begin the webinar.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and welcome to the Fire and EMS webinar on risk assessment. So I'm glad you joined us, and we're proud to be a supporter of CPSE and a sponsor of the Excellent Conference. A couple more logistical issues there. There is a chat function available in the webinar, GoToWebinar application. So please submit any questions and we'll get to them as we can. Understand that if we run over, that we will email you or you can email us, but we'll follow up after the webinar in reference to the questions. So as mentioned, I am Mike Cox and I am your Director of Fire and EMS Solutions for Esri. So essentially I'm your GIS liaison officer, if you will, and I'm proud to be joined today by Joe Powers, Deputy Chief of Charlottesville Fire. Joe, if you'd like to say hi.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me, and Mike, I look forward to doing this presentation with you.
Yep, thanks Joe, thanks for your time today. Esri, continues to support our users, and that's really why we're here, is to support you and provide whatever services you may need. Specific today, obviously, to risk assessment, but for any of your planning, accreditation, response, or recovery needs. And certainly one of the ways we provide that support to you is through our disaster response program. So many of you have likely dealt with our disaster response personnel, but it's at no additional cost. So, if you have that approaching hurricane or have a significant issue and need some direct assistance, you can simply go to our website and request that assistance to provide that. We've assisted over 5,000 agencies since the pandemic, and certainly are supporting wildland and hurricane issues here in late August of 2020. So GIS can be used in a multitude of ways, but when we talk about risk assessment, we really want to be able to understand what's impacting our communities, where is that impact, and then who is being impacted by these risks. And we do that by integrating various types of data. So we can bring in RMS data, our call records. We can bring in our CAD data, and certainly plans, target hazards, building information management data. All those can be brought together to give you a clear picture of what is in your community and what is at risk, including populations and demographics, which we'll talk a lot about today. So we're going to discuss a lot of fire risk today as a model, but please don't restrict these workflows simply to fire risk. We'll talk about structural firefighting, we'll talk about some wildland urban interface, but just about any risk in the community, you can leverage GIS to have a better understanding, to provide better decision-making products, to your staff and to your team. And we can do this with, again, any risk. So it could be a fall risk, it could be, a community paramedicine related risk, and certainly these disaster and fire risks are pretty commonly assessed, and GIS can improve those assessments. When we pull data, to review, particularly the fire risk, we pull our RMS data. It's typically presented in a database view, and that does give us some good information. But by adding that geospatial context, we can really better understand what's occurring and how it's occurring and who's occurring to. So you can see this visual perspective, map-based or map-centric, that easily communicates the risk within specific areas of the community. And that's a better way to assess it, because again, we can deploy resources in a more efficient manner, and we can certainly educate the public in those areas related to the risk that's specific down to a neighborhood level. As an example, here's an evacuation map that was used during a hurricane a couple of seasons ago. And what's amazing is the ability to bring in all these data sets, a lot of which are local, a lot of which you have access to locally or is provided through Esri as curated data. But so here are evacuation zones where we can identify not just how many people are in a given zone, but how many businesses, what's our economic impact? We can see things like how many households are without vehicles. And if you're talking about evacuating several 100,000 people, understanding how many households don't have a vehicle is a pretty important characteristic to understand, so we can work out the logistics of moving those people. And this is the power that GIS provides you. This is decision-making skills, or decision-making data rather, that you can provide your decision makers, whether it's in an emergency operations center, or it's in a command post, or you're in a planning or preparedness stage. And so the impacts in our community are changing and growing, and we know that because climate change and certainly public health, all of our fire service agencies now worldwide are part of the public health system, whether you like it or not. We're in the field addressing these issues, and we can use GIS to, again, understand the risk in the community and address not just fire risk, but it could be health risks or any major disaster. And that is continuing to occur throughout the world. So, certainly disaster response, we'll talk about identifying those evacuation zones, but, what if you had a flood zone, or what if you had an earthquake area, and you could easily identify what populations are in those areas, and how do we start to plan to support those community members as these impacts affect us. And so Joe, Chief Powers, is here to talk about some of his experience as a fire chief, and not just the accreditation process, but supporting his community as he moves forward with his community risk assessment. And Joe, and Chief Powers rather, has done a great job of using GIS to identify these issues. So Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone that's joining. It looks like a lot of people out there in virtual land. So we hope that we can provide you some good information. Please don't forget about the chat feature to ask those questions. And at the end, we'll have some time to talk a little bit amongst ourselves, answer some questions. And I think that'll have some value. The one thing I would like to start off here is talking about practical risk assessments. Mike did a good job of showing a lot of what Esri can do for us, but a lot of that sometimes gets lost in that it's complicated and difficult to understand when a lot of us can't even spell GIS. And that's where I came from. Probably back in 2014, 2013, I had little idea about what GIS was, but I realized the power of it and how it can start to visualize data. So that's what I would like to talk about a little bit. But first, I want to talk about where we come from so that we can all have an understanding of why this is important. So from a traditional fire prevention standpoint, the fire service for many, many years provided one big program to the community. And we still do that in October during Fire Prevention Week. We do that in a lot of our schools where we provide one program and we don't base it on the actual neighborhood or community risk. And we have the opportunity to do that with GIS. And when we look at that traditional fire prevention model, it's a very reactive model. It's reacting to our community rather than looking forward and understanding the data that we have available to us to start making some of those decisions, providing the right information to the right people to put program services, resources into the community. And even we're either going to prevent those incidents from occurring or help our communities be a little bit more resilient. So we all have the understanding that we're in a culture of community risk reduction in the fire service. And it's not so much a name change from fire prevention or the fire marshal's office to community risk reduction, but it's a total transformation of our industry. It's taking a section, a branch in our organizational chart and looking at it from a process standpoint, and how do we use the data, how do we use the perspectives, how do we use all of this that's now at our fingertips in 2020 to really make decisions for our community, to provide them the best outcomes we can. And of course, Vision 2020 has always been a good resource for community risk reduction. But when we think about community risk reduction, we're thinking about, first, we need to establish a risk assessment, and that's what we're meeting on today. We want to understand what risk is in our neighborhoods, what risk is in our communities, and then we also want to prioritize that risk, because it gets a little out of control when we start looking at the things that could happen and without any prioritization. But once we prioritize it, we can take the next steps in figuring out what is the right resource to begin minimizing or mitigating that risk. And then we deploy those resources into the community. And we can use that everything from a hurricane to fire inspections to smoke alarms to a fall prevention program. If we use this cycle of community risk reduction, we can identify what the risks are, figure out what's most important or what will provide the most outcome, find those right resources, deploy them, and start minimizing that risk. But that last element there, evaluation, is probably the most important because once we deploy the resources, we have to go back and reestablish that risk assessment, understand where the impacts and the outcomes are occurring in our community, and begin to capitalize it. And from a CPSE model, that's that continuous improvement that we have to embrace at an organizational level. So let's talk a little bit about using risk assessments in our community from a fire department perspective. So I spent almost 20 years in Henrico County and worked very closely with Mike there. But we very often, or quite often, said we need to deploy a fall prevention program, and we would like to use engine companies. And on Saturday, I need engine 10 to cover Zone A, engine 5 to cover Zone C, or A shift to cover Zone A, B shift to cover Zone C, and start hitting door by door, knocking on each door, providing some literature, and putting out a program just based on the area of that fire station. But that doesn't really do a lot for us with efficiencies and using technology such as GIS. We have the ability within GIS, and we have the ability within a risk assessment to identify the individual homes in a neighborhood that are most likely at risk for having occupants that will fall. So we can do that in a number of ways, and we can get into that later. But using the data that's currently available, we can identify homes that are at risk for smoke alarm, at risk for the absence of smoke alarms, at risk for falls, at risk for juvenile diabetes, all using the data that Esri provides and the data that we have available to us in our localities that we can push through many of the Esri products. And then we look at it from a citywide standpoint. So this is the city of Richmond, and I'm not picking on the city of Richmond, but it's a city much like the city of Charlottesville, where I am now, where we historically have provided one big program to the community and said that this is our fire prevention program, and we need to put smoke alarms out, or we need to do a fall prevention program, or we need to do X program. But we have the ability within GIS to break it down. We don't have the resources, we don't have the capacity to provide programs to every individual within our city or within our locality, but we do have the ability to identify the populations or the communities or those neighborhoods that are most at risk, and then start to provide programs to them. So maybe program A ends up being an alcohol program for VCU students. Program D may be deployed only during the spring when folks start coming out and spending time on the river with the warmer weather. Program B is a fall prevention program, and maybe program C is a smoke alarm program, because we've identified these areas that are most at risk for certain things, and we've prioritized them through that risk assessment. So when we start to think about community risk, we start to think at a community level. Not every community, not every person in a community requires us to have to provide them services. But when we break it down into specific communities, we realize that the communities likely need different programs because they have different needs and they have different risks. But if we take it a couple steps farther, we start to see that we can get into even the population level. So from a population level, we know that two-parent households with children have a much different risk level or need than a a household that only has one person that's over the age of 85, or a single parent household, or a household with all young adults. All of those pose differing risks, and we can see that all through a community risk assessment. But then again, we can always take it a little bit farther. We can start to understand the characteristics of each of those populations within those neighborhoods, right? We can understand where the high crime areas are, where the people are that are affected or impacted by high crime. We can understand mental health, where our mental health consumers are, where our drugs and alcohol take effect, or even in our subsidized housing, or in our communities. Where is it that those characteristics exist, and then we can start to pair our risk-based community risk assessment back to the programs that we can deploy. So, Mike.
Thanks, Joe. And so, Joe spoke specifically about the demographic and characteristics of our community based on population and needs of that population. And these data sets are available through our Living Atlas and through several applications we'll talk about today, but really allow you to quickly understand the profile of your community. And we do things like at-risk population group data sets, or it could be an economic impact, but all those data sets are available to you in the Living Atlas. And you can do these analysis down to a block by block level. But as an example, here's San Diego's first due districts from their fire department, and to be able to think about be able to be a station captain or a operational battalion chief, and to be able to look at a first due and understand median age or at-risk characteristics that may be present, English as a second language, or again economic status, those kind of issues that really impact how we respond to a given community and how we prepare for the risks we've identified. Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So when we take it from a citywide program or a jurisdiction-wide program, and we start to break it down into those community characteristics and population level, and even farther into how Mike was showing, we now become a very proactive organization. We become a proactive community, and we've left that traditional reactivity kind of behind us. So I'd like to talk about two programs that I've been involved in the past that worked out very well, and it was heavily, we leveraged GIS heavily to one, visualize what we were doing, but two, to prioritize and identify the areas where we needed to be. So let's talk a little bit about structure fires and the structure fire risk. So we're the fire department, and we run lots and lots of structure fires, but we obviously all understand that doesn't actually happen. But we do know that the contents in newer homes burn much faster than they did in the 60s. So we understand that we have a little bit of time to get out, and we start to base many of our programs on that. We also understand that although the interior furnishings burn at a much hotter and faster rate, we also understand that some of the exterior coverings of our homes burn at a faster and higher rate. And we have the ability to start to understand where these types of homes are and where the populations that may be most at risk. But we want to take it a little bit farther, and we start to realize that we see this more often than not during investigations. And this is coming straight out of Henrico County. So in Henrico County, in a relatively short amount of time, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but we had 6 or 7 fire deaths in just a matter of weeks from several different fires. And one of the common characteristics was a melted smoke alarm laying on the floor that did not have a battery. And we identified that as obviously as a huge risk to our community, and we started to mitigate that risk and identify the ways that we could do that. Now, in Henrico County, over the years, we realized a decrease in structure fires based on a number of factors, right? But we never really saw the same correlation with structure fire deaths over the same time period. So we knew that we were doing something right by decreasing the actual structure fires in our community, but it didn't really matter because there was not a decrease in structure fire deaths. So I'm a big fan of the second meeting theory. So my second meeting theory means that we brought together a whole host of agency heads and leaders within the county and said, this is what we need to do. We need to identify the risks in Henrico County that lead to structure fires and lead to homes without working smoke alarms. But we're not really sure how to do that. But we need to partner with as many folks as we can to make sure that we get this right. So the first meeting always goes well, and everybody thinks that that's a great idea. But what happens is most of the time, the people sitting at that first meeting have no idea how to do it, and they don't have the resources or training to get it done. So I think we invited 40 people to that first meeting. The second meeting, about 10 people, 15 people showed up, and they were the right people because those department heads and leaders within the county went back into their departments, grabbed the experts and sent them back for the second meeting. And we started to collaborate and identify data points and resources to start to really identify risk within the Henrico County community. So we pulled in property data, which we all have access to, and we can visualize it and prioritize it using many of the Esri tools. We pulled in tax data, local code enforcement, and calls for service, and a couple other, we dipped out of a couple other data buckets or databases to develop the risk assessment. And that started to help us to, one, identify where we needed to be, but it also allowed us to start to prioritize what was most important. So when we did that, we were able to identify parcels, not actual homes, but we started to be able to identify parcels within our community where a smoke alarm likely was not going to be installed, or it was going to be too old to be in working order. So then we needed to validate what we had identified. So when we started to do this validation, we took 10 years worth of structure fires in Henrico County. And Henrico County is about 350,000 people, over 244 square miles. And then we ran a fair amount of calls, I think 50 to 55,000 calls when I left at the end of 2019. So we had a fair amount of data to look at. And so we used Esri's tools to one, visualize where our structure fires were occurring, but also two, to visualize where the parcels are that we identified that were going to be most at risk for not having a working smoke alarm. And when we did this, it was an aha moment, and we realized that we were doing the right thing, because most of the parcels fell well within where the structure fires were occurring, and very little parcels fell outside of those of that area. So what we did was we identified in our first initial risk assessment, and now I think we're on our third iteration of the assessment. We identified 3,200 homes in the county. 54% had air conditioning, and this is just the at-risk home profile that we established and sent back out to our partners to let them know what we had done thus far. But most of the houses were small. Most of the houses were built a while ago. The average year built was 1951, and most of them had a relatively low assessment value. So we started to deploy resources out into the community, and we used light duty staff to do so. And we used Esri products to guide them through where they needed to go and start to collect some of this data. And we found that once we deployed light duty staff into in pool vehicles knocking on these very specific doors, we found that initially, as you can see down here at the bottom, initially the risk assessment was 75% reliable in identifying homes without a working smoke alarm. So that means that of the homes that we walked into, 75% of them did not have a working smoke alarm. When I left at the end of 2019, I believe that number was at 92% for the final number for the initial risk assessment for those 3,200 homes was 92% reliable for a risk assessment. So what does that do? That creates a very, very efficient program. It's providing the services to the people that are most at risk through the prioritization that we did, and we were using resources and not over exceeding their capacity. So from a standpoint of, so we're switching gears. So let's talk a little bit about inspections of occupancies. And Henrico County, and much like many other jurisdictions, used engine company personnel to go from business to business to do business inspections. But what I found, coming straight off of an engine company in 2014, I found that obviously most firefighters don't like doing this, and it doesn't typically provide the outcomes that we're looking for. So we started to look at how we can use Esri and GIS data to provide more efficiencies, to prioritize the program, and use that community risk assessment and that community risk reduction model. So the original program is what most people see. You take a form, you go into an occupancy, and you record some information. And we found that most of the violations that were being seen were an exit light that was not illuminated, or an extension cord that was being used for more than 45 days. It was a huge focus on code enforcement, which we had never really provided any training to our inspector or to our engine company firefighters. So we realized that this was a huge workload. We didn't have the capacity to do so, so we needed to apply a little bit of risk to guide decision making for this program. So what we did is we moved away from using we moved away from using use group to identify the hazards, and we started to use a risk assessment that identified target hazards just by the size, the height, the square footage, and a couple other factors to identify that as a target hazard. And we started to pre-plan, provide life safety surveys, and have tactics conversations. And instead of being code enforcement based, we started to do the things that the firefighters knew that we knew that firefighters like to do more so than code enforcement. They like to get out. They like to have tactics conversation. They wanted to see what were inside some of these buildings through pre-planning. And we did that by using a risk-based program. But we also used some of the Esri tools to collect the data in the field rather than using a paper-based program. We had mobile computers in all of our apparatus, and we deployed some of the Esri tools in order to do that. What we did is we decreased our overall workload by about 80%. So rather than inspecting each of those individual occupancies, we asked our engine companies to go out and do pre-plans, walkthroughs, and do life safety evaluations of an entire parcel. And if they found conditions such as, let's say, matches and gasoline being stored on the same shelf, then the fire marshal's office could get involved if through a little bit of education, if the occupants didn't want to change their practices. But that provides a lot more, using a little bit of data, using a little bit of risk and prioritization, we found that we could get more work out of our engine companies, but still by decreasing their workload. So it's a whole lot more efficient, obviously. So fast forward a couple years, and I make the transition out of Henrico County and into the city of Charlottesville. So the city of Charlottesville is about as opposite from Henrico County in every aspect that you can think of. Henrico County is a large county, 244 square miles with 350,000 people. The city of Charlottesville is a small college town. It's 50,000 people when UVA, University of Virginia, is in place, or excuse me, has students in the dorms. And we're 10 square miles and deploying 4 engine companies out of 3 stations. And when I came to when I left Henrico County and came to the city of Charlottesville, I distinctly remember people telling me that I was not going to be able to do the same thing in Charlottesville as I would have done in Henrico County, because the data is different. The data reliability, the data availability, and just the fact that we don't have the resources of the big county. And I pushed back and I said that I think that we can, I may not be able to do the same thing, but I think we have the ability to do something new, and do something that's gonna get to the same outcomes as what I was doing before. Mike?
Thanks, Joe. And to follow up on what Joe's speaking of there, you know, the efficiencies you can build into these responsibilities, particularly at the company level, the technology actually provides more of those efficiencies, because we're not doing a company level inspection of a convenience store, a 4,000 square foot convenience store. We can focus those resources where the most risk is. And some of the tools Joe's describing are available on our solutions page right off the shelf. Again, no additional cost. You know, most of the fire service agencies out there already have access to this. But one I wanted to point out or highlight today is our target hazard analysis solution. So you think about, you know, engine companies or company level personnel having to go out in the district and identify target hazards, which we still want to be in the target hazards, but can we identify the highest risk target hazards and address those first and most often, and where it's required? Then we can identify where do we do our pre-plans, and maybe I do a pre-plan in my high risk occupancies every year, or updated every year, or in my lower risk, you know, I do every second or third year, just to more efficiently deploy resources for that workload. And the target hazard analysis pulls your local data and does an assessment on every parcel and every structure to set a risk score. And so much like Joe was mentioning earlier, it comes off the shelf as establishing a risk score based on occupancy type, life safety risk, fire flow requirements, economic impact, and obviously building area and building height. And this is a very similar workflow that Joe described the team applying even for those single family dwellings. You know, you identify those characteristics, you pull data from your local parcel layer, you pull data from demographic layer where that's appropriate, and you run through this type of analysis, and it identifies on the map, you know, where are my highest risk target hazard. It identifies on the map, you know, where are the homes most likely to have a fire fatality, or any risk we've been discussing. You can identify and then focus resources where they're needed. So we're not doing those, you know, neighborhood blasts after our structure fire for home safety surveys. We know which houses in those neighborhoods are at the highest risk based on these types of hazard and risk assessments. Joe?
So thanks, Mike. I want to plug that solutions page too, again, because a lot of times I'll call Mike or one of or somebody else within Esri, and I'm like, hey, I think I can do this. I'm just not sure how. How do I do it? And almost 100% of those conversations ends in, hey, I'll tell you how to do it, but it's also available on our solutions page because Esri's built that out so well. So Mike was talking about the local parcel layer, and there's a wealth of information there. So one of the first things that I did when I got to the point within in the last few months and needed to start to develop the risk assessment to drive some of our programs and services within the city is I started to look for GIS data to understand what data is out there. So it's been a while since I was in Arc Desktop or Arc or any desktop version of ArcGIS. So I jumped into Arc Pro for the first time and started to look through the data that the city had, and I found that there was a fair amount of information in there. But I also went to the city's website, and I've gone to some of our partner or other like-sized cities and looked at what they had. But most people are using GIS or allowing GIS data to be viewed on the public-facing website. So I found this GIS link when we updated our city's website, and I was like, oh, look, that might be a good place to start. So when I got into there, I found that one, we do have a parcel layer, but you quickly realize just by expanding and literally just playing with the data and clicking things on and off, you realize that there's a lot of information that the city has, especially from the Charlottesville standpoint, that we're just not using. Now, we're not using it from a fire department standpoint, but many of the other departments across the city are using these. But I found that every occupancy within the city of Charlottesville indicated if it had a basement and how many square feet of basement it had, and if it was a finished or unfinished basement. So that plays huge, that can pay huge dividends in providing firefighters during structure fires with key information prior to arrival. And can we tie that data into our 911 center somehow? I'm not sure, but I'm going to certainly work on it because we have the information available. But what I started to do was I started to realize that we have all of this data available on the back end that's not public, and we have all of this data on the public side. So I started working with our GIS professionals to start to pair this data together, to join this data together so that we could see the bigger picture. One of the other things that I found was that in the city of Charlottesville, it's actually divided into 19 different neighborhoods. And using GIS and using the data that I found that's on the public side and the non-public side, I started to approach this not from a community risk assessment standpoint, but from a neighborhood risk assessment standpoint. So knowing that the polygons are available for the neighborhoods, I took it a step farther and I started to work with people much smarter than me, join these databases together, and realize that each of these point layers had, 50, 75 different things that we could run an analysis against. And then it started to tell the story of each of our neighborhoods in a much greater detail than any of us have ever done within the city of Charlottesville before. And it's going to drive the community risk assessment and decision making for the fire department much more than it ever has in the past. Because we found that this is all Arc Pro, and as I play with it more and more, I find more data and more ways that I can bring things together. So now I have an understanding that not all of our city has basements. Not all of our engine companies are in an area that have finished basements or unfinished basements. But I can find out that I have the ability to see what the exterior walls are made of, how the roof is constructed, when the last time a plumbing permit was issued. We have all of that information, and that plays huge into a community risk assessment. So what we're doing now is I've got Lucas, who is our data analyst for the fire department, running a neighborhood risk assessment using any information that he can find out of incident responses. And then from a city standpoint, I found some GIS professionals within the city that found that this project was something that was a whole lot more interesting than doing stormwater assessments. So they're working with me on pulling as much other data as they can per neighborhood. And now we're going to start to have multiple attributes coming together to tell the story of each of our neighborhoods. And likely we won't use it all, but I think that it's going to, once it's done, and we hope to have it done by the end of the year, once it's done, we're going to have a pretty solid neighborhood risk assessment.
Thanks, Joe. And all risk assessments, all responses start with some sort of risk assessment, whether we're talking about, a structural engine pulling up on a house fire, doing that size up with company officers en route to those kind of calls, whether it's, a flood management program, we do a risk assessment before we actually take action, whether it's understanding where our wildland urban interface is and maybe fuel management issues. All of that requires a good risk assessment to help you make good decisions. And as you can see on the screen now, that's our community analyst application that many of you already have access to, that you can use to truly understand, what is the impact in my locality, and generate these information products, these visual products that you can send to decision makers or out to your community so they can understand, what is my risk and how is my neighborhood being impacted. So a couple of action items I want to provide to the audience that to address these community risk assessment issues. Please take time, first of all, to talk to your GIS professionals within your organization, within your city, county, state, or country. So establishing that relationship is incredibly important, and they can provide capabilities that may not be available within your fire and EMS agency. Also, take time to review Esri's Living Atlas. A lot of the data sets that Joe was describing are available there, and you can review those without any kind of login. You can see what's available to you. And finally, please go to that solutions page, solutions.arcgis.com. That has a section under local government for fire, and also an excellent section on emergency management. A lot of off-the-shelf solutions you can simply download and start using today to build better efficiencies or build efficiencies into your response. And with that, I'm going to see about questions. Cindy, how are we doing on that?
We have a few. One of the questions I believe you just answered is where can you find the solutions page? So can you mention that again?
Yes, ma'am. So yeah, solutions.arcgis.com is the solutions page, and you'll see many verticals there, for local and state governments. But again, look for the fire service. There's the law enforcement section, emergency management section. All those have excellent off-the-shelf solutions you can employ immediately.
Okay. Let's see. Can you give some examples on how the fire department collected certain information based on what I saw was the only data set they were collecting the calls for service, and what Esri products were used to collect data after locations were identified?
So there's certainly a couple of methods that you can use to collect data in the field. And first I want to make a point is, the target hazard assessment doesn't require any field data collection to start that. So we can identify the highest risk target hazards without putting anybody in the field. That's all, that's all using the parcel layer data and local data to identify that. But also, as an example, on the solutions page, we do have a pre-planned solution that uses Arcgis Collector, one of our mobile applications, to go out and actually drop symbology on the map as the engine company or company level personnel are walking through a structure. So they can tag hazmat stores, they can tag an alarm panel or fire department connection. And then what's so efficient about it is it can immediately show up on the map, throughout your entire jurisdiction or mutual aid agencies if that's a concern. So as soon as they drop that symbol, and you can work in a verification process, but anybody else that has access to that map layer immediately sees those pre-planned characteristics. You can also use Survey 123. A lot of agencies are using Survey for home safety surveys, or they're using Survey 123 for business inspections. Anything that required a form to fill out can be done in Survey 123 and provide a much better data submission workflow.
Hey Mike, can I jump in real quick too?
Please do.
Yeah. So when COVID-19 infected our community and our calendars, we redeployed many of the resources within the fire department to other areas of the city to maintain capacity and resources and work toward recovery and reopening in the future. But we also took that opportunity to play catch up on a lot of things in Charlottesville that we hadn't done in the past. So one of the using Esri tools, one of the things that we did almost immediately was I contacted Knoxbox, and I asked Knoxbox for a most up-to-date list of the places where they had sent key boxes. They sent me a spreadsheet. I loaded that into ArcGIS Online. I transferred over to Workforce, and I established a work project within Workforce and assigned a single resource to go out and look at every address where a Knox box had been sent, and then to geolocate using Survey 123 where that Knox box actually was, and then collect a little bit extra data on description that it's actually on the left-hand side of the hallway going at the bottom of the stairs. But we also used that Survey 123 to identify where all of our FDCs are, and a lot of other features within the city. During about a 3-week period, we were able to identify, locate almost all of our Knox boxes, actually all the Knox boxes we know about, and most of the FDCs on the buildings, and we had never done that before. And we used we used one resource, one person that was unable to do fire inspections anymore. So we redeployed them to do that, and it worked out really, really well.
Great success story, Joe. Thanks. Cindy, anything else on your side?
Yep. Okay, did you have a problem with people not allowing you in their home?
And Joe, I'll
Yes,
defer that one
yeah,
to you.
yeah, absolutely. So, we were using light duty folks, and they, firefighters that were that had the understanding of the community, but it took a solid week to probably a week to 2 weeks to develop the spiel, for the lack of a better word, to get into somebody's house. And the first two firefighters we used were not very successful in the first couple days, and we identified the need to figure out what it is what's the right thing to say. I think we ended up documenting it, and they had it on the dashboard of the truck that they were driving around in, so that they would remember. One of the things we found is we had to use a marked fire department vehicle. So the vehicle we were using was a pool vehicle from the city. So we ripped the city's logo off the side, put fire department stickers and things all over it, got some magnetic signs that said free smoke alarm program or something to that effect. Deployed with a new spiel to get in the door. And I don't want to misquote our entry rate, but our entry rate was probably around 70 to 75% of the people that actually answered the door. And we were doing it during daylight hours, during business or weekdays, daylight hours. So there was some people that just weren't home because they were at work. But once we figured out the right thing to say and the right vehicle to pull up in, we were able to get into the homes.
Okay, awesome. What has been used in 3D mapping and vertical risk?
So that is an area of growth. We're seeing significant capabilities being developed. Of course, the inclusion of the Z-axis coordinates and required for next gen 911 is going to be, a significant tool for us to use to understand where, say, in a high-rise structure, a patient is, even, for a day-to-day 911 call, to understand that yes, that they're on the 30th floor, not the 3rd floor. So we see the easy integration of BIM data and CAD data. When I say CAD data, I mean computer-aided design, building plans, 3D plans easily integrated into GIS, where you can start doing pretty dynamic, pretty comprehensive pre-plans in a floor-by-floor level, and actually start to develop, indoor routing capabilities. So, we know if the fire alarm's on the 5th floor in this quadrant or this division, we're going to take this stairwell to get there. And so we see more and more of that occur. There's certainly some, if you'll give me an email out there at mike_cox@esri.com, I can send you to the appropriate website so you can see some of that 3D capability and what's available today.
Okay, there's several more, so let's see. Does the Arcgis collector require individual GIS login credentials? We have such issues with our crew having so many logins, they share devices, change stations often, etc., that we don't want them to have to struggle to access the program they need to use. This can be answered offline if necessary. This isn't the first time our fire agency has had this conversation with Esri.
Yes, the requirement by licensing is that the login needs to be tied to a person. But what we see as a practice is, typically on say an engine company or a ladder truck, that the company officer is the one logging into a device. Even though that device may move from person to person throughout the shift, it's still the responsibility of that company officer. And you want that built-in security so you can understand at least what crew is impacting or adding data or maybe deleting data, but it provides for some of that security as well. So you just don't have an open data set or an open access to what could be tactical information. But yeah, please also give me an email. We can discuss how some of that's being done as we deploy from fire agencies around the world.
Okay, is the Living Atlas available to anyone, or is that locally built?
That is available to anyone. You can go to the website now and start reviewing that data. A lot of it is or some of it's open data, and anybody that has an account currently has access to everything but premium data within the Living Atlas. So, real-time traffic, real-time weather, the hurricane, tropical storm system weather feeds, all that's there. Wildland, a significant amount of wildland feed as well, data sets. So, you can go to the website and browse it without any kind of login and see what data is available, and to actually start using that data. It's provided, majority of it's provided with any account holder.
Do these product use Esri credits? If so, what is the order of magnitude?
So some of the analysis will, and I'll be honest with you, I cannot even estimate what that is. It's not a significant amount to do some of these analysis, and it's usually related to things like drive time analysis and those kind of things. But enriching data on a map can use credits. So let me connect you with somebody who can give you the specifics of that, so I don't steer you in the wrong direction. Please give me an email there at mike_cox@esri.com.
All right, a few more. Is there an existing Fire Rescue Esri GIS forum or discussion board?
We do outreach based on these webinars, and you can certainly go to our website and catch up on previous webinars and blogs that are out there. And we are continuing to provide or seek ways to virtually engage with our users and this community. So you'll see some of those capabilities or some of those events coming in the near future.
In addition to some of the existing sources of data, Knox, for example, did you have to create some data from scratch? Who was responsible for getting the data configured, loaded into Esri at first, and who is responsible for ensuring sustainable success?
So if you're talking
so
if you're talking Knoxbox information, I'm really not that smart when it comes to interacting with the location data and getting it into ArcGIS. But it came in as a spreadsheet, and really all I was trying to do is I was trying to fill somebody's calendar for the next 3 weeks and collect some useful information. So from a workflow standpoint, I took the spreadsheet that Knox sent me. I think I renamed one of the headings to address or something like that, and I pulled it over into ArcGIS Online, and it immediately recognized the addresses. I think there was only a few that it didn't recognize, so I went back and I fixed them. And I was able from there. I was able to pull that map's worth of information over into Esri's workforce and assign that to a single user account, because we had 3 assigned to the fire department at the time. And then he used Esri's workforce and navigator to drive from each place in the most efficient route and collect the information. And now we have a web map and feature services and things like that show where the FDCs, the key boxes, some places of hoarding, vacant homes, places of possible rescue, things like that, all built out and available for our folks in the engine companies and ladders.
And you can certainly, bring in any data that has a location component. Depending on the format, obviously some is going to be easier than others. Like Joe was describing, just bringing in a database format, as long as you can identify that XY coordinate or street address or whatever it is, it can be easily integrated into GIS. And a wide range of other data types. So whether we're talking about LiDAR 3D modeling and or again real-time data you might need for, say, an operational dashboard in the field, all that can be easily integrated. Just depends on what the source is, and that's typically where most of your difficulties arise. Is some of the data sets that you want owned by other agencies may be protected by some kind of policy or practice that's in place that oftentimes we have to work through. But that's also a conversation that we on the Esri side can support or assist you with. So if you run into issues, about getting data, particularly if it's out of a CAD or an RMS system or something along those lines, please reach out. We can support that. And many of the CAD vendors and records management vendors are partners of ours to begin with. So we should be able to work through some of those issues relatively easily.
All right, next one. Is there a reduced pricing structure beyond the 21-day ArcGIS online introduction for fire departments?
I would have to look that up and get back to you on that. So again, send me an email related to that. Public safety does have a specific or a special pricing set, but I can't provide that. I can't quote it right off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. So I apologize. Please shoot me an email and we'll get that straight for you.
All right. In the opening pages, I was able to see a chief's dashboard. Does Charlottesville or Henrico use a dashboard?
Yeah, so Charlottesville City does not, and we are moving toward. We're still in the early phases of consuming GIS and consuming information in the front seats of a fire truck or on a screen in a chief's office or even for the battalion chief. But we're moving very quickly in that direction. But it's as everybody knows, change within the fire service is not the easiest thing. And but information sharing typically is. So we're gaining a lot of ground with implementing products such as Survey 123, Workforce, and building out dashboards is on our horizon.
And certainly that dashboard is available for, you know, a live dashboard using CAD data and AVL data, bringing in live weather, flood gauges, you know, things of that nature. And also it's a good view for, you know, a historic view of your records management system data. But that's another one that is available on our solutions page, solutions.arcgis.com, under local government and then the fire service. It's called monitoring fire incidents, and you can set that dashboard up either with static CAD data, you know, for a year, 3 years, 5 years to start identifying trends, or you can also connect that to your CAD system for a live feed from CAD and AVL to actually have an operational view for day-to-day operations.
Okay. Can a webinar using SLOSH, SLOSH model DEMS be done with the flood impact solution?
I believe so, but it would have to be verified by somebody much smarter than I am. So please, again, send me an email, Mike_Cox@Esri.com. I know we do a lot with those models, but we can get into the specifics of exactly how you want to integrate it.
Okay, and this might be the last one. Can Collector or Survey 123 push data to another non-GIS RMS application that captures lat long? I guess latitude and longitude, maybe.
Yes, I mean, there are various methods you can export data like that or have it communicate with another system or application. As an example, in Survey, you can use webhooks to even generate an email to a notification if a certain answer is answered a certain way. You can automatically generate those kind of notifications and export that data to various application required data sets.
Yeah, City of Charlottesville is actually using Survey 123 to help collect COVID questions and responses from our workforce throughout the city. And once you answer a question the quote unquote wrong way, it immediately sends an email or a notification to an infection control team to go out and mitigate that employee.
Yeah, and another example, you know, Joe mentioned the EOC earlier, Emergency Operations Center, the two-way communication capability between ArcGIS and WebEOC, as an example, through that API connector. So you could have data flowing from, you know, a survey or a collector back into a WebEOC product. That's probably a better example of what the question was related to.
And that was it. Perfect timing. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And Mike and Joe, thank you for a great, hold on, we got one more. I missed the first part. Will the video be sent out? Ron, yes, it is. There will be an email coming your way with a link. So yeah, thanks everybody. And Mike, Joe, do you guys have one last word?
Just please make note of my contact information, Mike_Cox@Esri.com. I know I've only said it about 50 times, but you know, 24/7 if you need assistance related to an incident or response, or certainly if you need to get together some capabilities for a planning process or risk assessment, let me know.
Yeah, and my email address is powers@charlottesville.org or charlottesville.gov. Sorry, we just changed it. If you ever need the practical side of how Esri works and GIS works, you know, please let me know. I'm happy to help.
All righty, no more questions. Thank you very much. And everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and contact us if you have any questions.
Thank you, Cindy.
All right, thanks, bye.